and exhibited, whether it was on nylon strings and the sort of more classical approach.
He doesn't argue. He doesn't complain. Jimmy Page just listens, then decides. And once he closes that door, it stays closed.
It was something within the music, something really new, something for people to be able to enjoy and connect.
For over half a century, Jimmy Page has shaped the sound of modern guitar, layering riffs, bending genres, and engineering albums like blueprints for controlled chaos. But beneath the solos and mystique, there's something sharper, something quieter: judgment. He doesn't shout, he doesn't name names often, but when he does, it's deliberate, icy, and final. He doesn't feud in headlines, he feuds in silence. Page didn't just play guitar, he built architecture out of distortion. He didn't chase approval, he rewrote the rulebook. And when someone played sloppy, when the feel was fake, Page didn't attack, he just never called again. He respected tone, obsession, precision, but only a handful of guitarists earned his attention, and even fewer earned his silence. Because when Jimmy Page doesn't like a player, he doesn't talk about them, he erases them. Here are the 5 names he didn't erase, but didn't forgive either. The guitarists Page quietly, completely rejected, and why none of them ever made it into his circle. Number 1. Richie Blackmore. Among the many guitarists who rose in the late 60s and early 70s, few cast a shadow as long or as dark as Richie Blackmore. But while most of the world saw him and Jimmy Page as peers, even rivals, Page never embraced the comparison. He never acknowledged it. Because in his world, Blackmore didn't belong in the same sentence. Both men redefined British rock guitar in their own ways. Blackmore, with his classical leanings and explosive stage presence in Deep Purple, created a sound that was undeniably sharp, theatrical, and loaded with technical prowess. Page, in contrast, operated from a space that was more shadow than spotlight, where feel, mood, and control of space mattered more than clean precision. The difference wasn't just stylistic, it was philosophical, and the clash began almost immediately. As Led Zeppelin was breaking global records, Blackmore began firing shots in interviews. He called Page's live sound sloppy, and described Led Zeppelin as a studio band with an image problem. In a now infamous 1975 quote to Sounds magazine, Blackmore said, "He's more of a producer than a guitarist, great at layering things, less great at playing them." That quote traveled, and Page heard it. But he didn't respond, not with words. He simply made sure that Blackmore's name never came up in his own press, never gave him the satisfaction of recognition. There were multiple points of intersection, festivals, radio charts, even shared engineers, but the two men never shared a conversation. And that wasn't by accident. When asked about Page during his own interviews, Blackmore doubled down. He accused Zeppelin of borrowing Deep Purple's keyboard guitar dynamics. He claimed Zeppelin stole the thunder and marketed mystery as if it were talent. And then he twisted the knife. "As a producer, Page is fine, but I wouldn't want him in my band." That kind of critique didn't shake Page publicly, but insiders say it lingered. It wasn't that he felt threatened by Blackmore, it's that he found him unmusical, too caught up in showing off, too performative. In private conversations, Page once said, referring to unnamed peers, "Some guitarists play like they're fighting the instrument. I prefer to disappear inside it." No names were used, but the implication didn't go unnoticed. Even when asked years later to list the guitarists he respected most from the British invasion era, Page consistently mentioned Peter Green, Jeff Beck, and even Eric Clapton, despite rivalries. But Blackmore? He never appeared on the list, not once. While Blackmore moved on to form Rainbow, and later returned to medieval-inspired acoustic music, Page never spoke about him, not when Zeppelin broke records, not during the Unleaded tour, and not even during Celebration Day retrospectives. To Page, Blackmore simply didn't exist, and the feeling seemed to remain mutual, until late in Blackmore's career, when he began subtly acknowledging Page's success with lines like, "I always found Zeppelin boring, but the production was clever." Page never replied. Even when Deep Purple was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2016, without Blackmore present, Page offered no statement, no congratulations, and no mention. It wasn't pettiness. It was consistency. This wasn't a war of insults. It was a refusal to engage. Where Blackmore wanted recognition, Page delivered silence. Where Blackmore demanded comparisons, Page declined the conversation. And when asked decades later whether he'd ever considered working with Blackmore in any capacity, Page gave the shortest answer of his career: no. Because for Jimmy Page, it wasn't just about sound, it was about soul. And Richie Blackmore, for all his technique, never made the cut. Not because he played too loud, but because he played for himself. And Jimmy Page, he was always listening for something else. Number 2. Jeff Beck. Some rivalries are loud, others echo in what's left unsaid. Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck weren't just contemporaries, they were yardbirds. Brothers in guitar, invention, and everything that came before Led Zeppelin was even a rumor, but what should have been the most sacred bond in Page's career became something else entirely, a silent fracture that never healed. In 1966, Page joined the Yardbirds after Beck had already established himself as the wild, unpredictable virtuoso. The idea was simple: dual guitars, experimental freedom, a laboratory for the future of rock. But it didn't last. Behind the scenes, Beck was volatile, often disappearing from sessions or arguing over direction. Page, who had built his entire reputation in the studio, valued structure and execution. Their creative chemistry should have changed rock history. Instead, it fizzled, fast. By the end of the year, Beck was out, Page was in, and that was that. Beck claimed it was his own decision. But Page never confirmed the story, never corrected it either. Decades later, Beck would reflect on the break with passive sharpness, saying, "Jimmy was the architect, I was the earthquake, we couldn't build anything together." After Beck left, Page rebuilt the band into Led Zeppelin. The foundation was his. And Beck? He went solo, experimenting with fusion, jazz rock, and blues breaks that often felt like brilliant chaos. But while critics praised Beck's innovation, Page quietly dismissed it. In a 1975 interview, Page said, "Technique is useful, but it only matters if it disappears behind emotion." He didn't name Beck. He didn't have to. Their relationship remained strangely formal. They attended some of the same events. Were photographed together? Rarely. But in the way they played and talked about music, the tension was always visible. Beck once claimed he was offered a spot in Led Zeppelin, before Page recruited Jimmy's actual lineup. Page never confirmed that story either, but when asked if Beck would have worked in Zeppelin, he said bluntly, "That would have been a very short conversation." When the 2009 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony rolled around, Page inducted Beck into the hall for a second time. They shook hands, smiled for the camera. But Page's speech was careful, brief, and clinical. He praised the music, not the man. There was no embrace, no warmth, only acknowledgement. Then came Beck's passing in 2023. The rock world paid tribute. Long, heartfelt messages flooded the press. But Page, he released a short paragraph. It praised Beck's curiosity, his tone, his spirit. But there was no story, no memory, no grief. That wasn't indifference. It was closure. Because for Jimmy Page, Beck represented something more complex than rivalry. He was the friend who disappeared, the fellow genius who refused to stay in sync, the player who could have shared the legacy, but chose to challenge it. And Page, who spent his entire life building sound with silence, left one message for Beck: "You left first, and I never followed." Number 3. Eric Clapton. For decades, Jimmy Page and Eric Clapton were spoken about in the same breath, two of the original British guitar gods, each with his own mythology, each held up as the face of a different kind of rock religion, and for a time, they even seemed connected. Both passed through the Yardbirds. Both shaped the blueprint for guitar-driven music that came to define the late 60s. But as time passed, and careers evolved, Page stopped speaking Clapton's name. It wasn't an explosion. It was a quiet severing. Something that happened slowly without headlines until it became permanent. Back in the early days, when Clapton left the Yardbirds in protest over the band's shift toward pop, it was Page who refused to take his spot immediately out of loyalty. Instead, he recommended Jeff Beck. Page didn't want to replace Clapton, he still respected him, at least then. But time changed everything. Page went on to create something entirely his own, heavy, mystical, meticulous. Led Zeppelin wasn't just a band, it was a sonic cathedral. Clapton, meanwhile, moved through Cream, Blind Faith, solo records, and a growing tendency to romanticize blues through an increasingly narrow lens. To Page, Clapton's music had become less about exploration and more about imitation, less risk, more routine. In a 1977 interview, Page didn't mention Clapton directly, but the intent was unmistakable when he said, "Blues is a foundation, but you've got to build on it, otherwise it's just echo." For Page, Clapton's obsession with traditional blues began to feel like an anchor, something holding back innovation rather than pushing it forward. And as Clapton became more visible, more celebrated, and eventually knighted, Page grew increasingly silent. He rarely mentioned Clapton's playing, even when asked directly. He'd pivot the conversation, shift to Beck or Green, or cite American players like Hubert Sumlin or Link Wray. But he rarely, if ever, gave Clapton the nod. The deeper issue wasn't musical, it was personal. When Clapton's political and personal controversies began to pile up, Page took note. In private circles, he reportedly referred to Clapton's infamous 1976 onstage rant as embarrassing and inexcusable. He never addressed it publicly, but the distance widened. The man once considered a peer was now something else entirely. By the 1990s, Page had effectively erased Clapton from his narrative. In interviews about influence, he avoided comparisons. Even in shared retrospectives, documentaries, anthologies, tribute specials, Page's commentary would always land elsewhere. When asked during a 2004 Rolling Stone interview whether Clapton's playing had any direct impact on his own style, Page responded with, "He was important to a lot of people. I was working on something different." It wasn't shade, it was separation. The only time Page appeared alongside Clapton in any public setting was during the Arms charity concerts in the early 80s, where Beck, Clapton, and Page all took the stage. The performances were historic, but the body language between Page and Clapton was distant, cordial but cold. No collaboration followed, no reunion, no further comment. When Clapton lost his son in the early 90s and released Tears in Heaven, Page reportedly sent a private message of condolence. It was respectful, but still he stayed out of the press. Page respected grief, but that didn't mean the divide had closed. What had started as shared roots had become divergent paths. Clapton continued to embrace blues orthodoxy, while Page leaned further into texture, mythology, and sonic layering. Where Clapton sought refinement, Page pursued shadow. And while Clapton's name remains etched into most lists of the greatest guitarists, Page has left him off his own for decades. No feud, no insult, just a space where connection used to be. Because for Jimmy Page, respect isn't a given. It's earned and protected, and once it's gone, it doesn't come back. Number 4. Eddie Van Halen. Eddie Van Halen never insulted Jimmy Page directly, but he didn't need to. Their relationship was defined by distance, from their personalities, their philosophies, and from the way each man saw the guitar itself. To Eddie, the instrument was a playground. To Jimmy, it was a ritual, and that difference was never resolved. Page was never a technician. He didn't want to be. His greatness lived in the layering, the mystery of how parts collided to create atmosphere. But when Eddie exploded into the mainstream in the late 70s, everything changed. Suddenly, playing fast, loud, and clean was the new standard, and Page's style, it started getting called sloppy. That shift in narrative didn't go unnoticed. In interviews, Eddie often spoke about his admiration for Page's early work, especially on Led Zeppelin 1. But his compliments always carried an edge. In a 1980 interview with Guitar World, Van Halen said, "I loved Jimmy's production, but I never understood why he didn't clean up his live playing." That line stuck. Page, by that time, had already begun facing criticism for his onstage inconsistencies, worsened by addiction and overexposure. Eddie's words weren't cruel, they were surgical, and Page heard them. He never responded directly, but from that moment forward, he never publicly acknowledged Van Halen as an influence or peer. Not once. When asked about the emergence of shred guitar and the finger-tapping explosion that followed, Page dismissed the trend with a wave. "Speed is fascinating, but it's not music." Eddie had changed the entire trajectory of rock guitar, but Page remained silent. He never called, never collaborated, never paid tribute. Even in moments where their paths crossed, award shows, industry events, back-channel offers, they kept a polite distance. One producer who worked with both men said, "Jimmy saw Eddie as the future, and he didn't like the future." What made it more complex was that Eddie did respect Page, at least in theory. He cited him often in his early days, and Van Halen's first few records carried traces of Zeppelin's influence. But the more Eddie innovated, the less Page had to say. It wasn't envy, it was refusal. When Eddie passed in 2020, tributes flooded in. Page's was one of the last to appear, and one of the shortest. He praised Eddie's impact, his technique, his tone, but there was no story, no warmth, just distance. Because Jimmy Page didn't hate Eddie Van Halen, he just never embraced what he represented. A new kind of guitar, a new kind of fame, and a new kind of spotlight that Page never asked for, and never needed. Number 5. Ingui Mmstein. Ingui Mmstein never really existed in Jimmy Page's universe, and that absence says everything. By the mid-1980s, Mmstein was a rising god among guitarists, young, brash, classically trained, and louder than anyone else in the room. He built his brand on speed and technical perfection, positioning himself as the bridge between heavy metal and virtuoso-level neoclassical composition. To a generation of guitarists, he was the next step forward. To Jimmy Page, he was something else entirely. There's no record of the two men ever meeting, no joint performance, not even a photo. But Mmstein had a habit of speaking Page's name, especially when asked to compare himself to the legends who came before him. In one interview from the early 90s, Mmstein said, "I respect Jimmy Page for what he did, but technically, come on, it's night and day." He followed it with another jab years later. "I've never been impressed by sloppiness dressed up as feel." He didn't need to say who he was talking about. Everyone knew. Page, as usual, never responded. But he never gave Mmstein the recognition he gave to other post-Zeppelin players. He wouldn't even say his name. When asked in a rare 2001 Q&A about the explosion of shredders in the 80s and 90s, Page kept his answer short. "A lot of notes, not a lot of stories." Mmstein, meanwhile, continued to rise, leaning further into excess, longer solos, more layered compositions, and a reputation for ego that matched his fretboard speed. Critics loved his technique. Page didn't. He once told a journalist, when speaking broadly about guitar evolution, "If you play like a machine, you get treated like one. Replaceable." That wasn't a blanket statement. It was targeted, and it landed. Even among Mmstein's peers, Page's name held a different kind of weight. He wasn't just a guitarist, he was a producer, arranger, and composer. His playing wasn't perfect, but it was deliberate, and where Mmstein chased speed, Page chased space. The truth is, Jimmy Page didn't hate Ingui Mmstein. He simply had no use for him. To Page, the guitar was never a competition. It was a tool to build sound, mystery, and memory. Mmstein turned it into an athletic event, and that, to Page, was the biggest mistake of all, because perfection can be learned. But feel, you're either born with it, or you're not. He didn't start fights, he ended conversations. Jimmy Page never named enemies. He didn't need to. He simply chose who stayed in his orbit, and who never got a second look. Some of these guitarists were faster, louder, more polished. But Page wasn't chasing applause. He was building something quieter, something permanent. And in his world, silence spoke louder than critique. A missing name said more than a headline. No reaction was the clearest response of all. They weren't rivals. They were reminders of what he didn't value, of who he didn't become. Because Page never played to impress, he played to vanish. Inside the sound, inside the story, inside the myth he built and sealed shut. And if your name didn't echo in that space, you were never really part of it.